Hello and welcome to Lifelong Scribe, and today we're going to be talking about the Book of Spells, 150 Magical Ways to Achieve Your Heart's Desire. This book is written by Ella Harrison, a witch here on YouTube. She's been a Wicca for many years, but now describes herself as a German folk witch. She brings up some of this history in her foreword, giving her family background, how long she's been practicing, and touching on the fact that her practice has changed throughout the years, as well as what her goals are for this book. I found this interesting as it gives you an idea of where she is coming from, and she is very honest about her Wiccan influence. This book is a spell book first and foremost, as it says in the title, so expect it to be primarily that, a list of spells to try. However, as she says that your path may start with this book, and that its first chapter, Spellcraft, goes into such topics as what a spell is, who can perform it, how they work and more, I feel this book is being aimed at the relatively new to witchcraft and magic. As such, I feel it doesn't explain things enough for beginners, and some terms and topics are touched upon very casually without giving definition, context, or explanation, which I think is problematic. For example, a spell is defined as when we intentionally direct energy to achieve a desired outcome, we cast a spell. You can draw this energy from the mind and will, ingredients or particular objects, or through practices and rituals. But what this energy is, how we supposedly draw on it, how it is directed, or how it's supposed to achieve these desired outcomes is left vague. Similarly with the definition of magic, it says people can write it as magic with a C or magic CK, and that some call it miracles, others call it witchcraft. But magic is no one strictly defined concept. It's subject to individual interpretation. You could say our very existence, the perfect system of people, nature, and life itself is magic. I've discussed briefly in my video on Magic, a very short introduction by Owen Davids, just how difficult it can be to define magic and the differences between magic and witchcraft, but briefly I will say that, while there is a lot of overlap, I personally would say that the difference between the two seems to come from whether you are petitioning or praying for a god's help/intervention, versus whether you believe you hold the power to effect these changes, that you command these changes to happen or command the gods to make these changes for you. The second example is magic. And miracles equated to magic in one line like this is too simplistic and is ignoring a whole tradition and its beliefs. Furthermore, when magic begins to be defined as found in everything, then this definition feels too vague to be useful. And finally, magic with a K is used, but the history of this spelling is not touched upon. This is problematic, seeing as it was popularised, though not created, by Aleister Crowley to distinguish his magic from conjuring. In the section Creating Your Altar, she touches on sigils, knots, cauldrons, grimoires, athame, and more, but it is a very brief definition which doesn't touch on any of the history behind where these things come from. She even drops in Thelema without elaborating on it, which I feel is a little irresponsible. Though I'm sure many will say it is a matter of personal conscience whether you follow this or not, I still feel that giving some context for what Thelema is important, especially in a beginner book, otherwise some may not understand this dubious history. The fact that it is mentioned in the same sentence as Wicca, for an example of a ceremonial path, can make it sound more innocent than it is and was. In brief, Thelema was created by Aleister Crowley, and in my opinion, he is somewhat of a problem person. In the same vein as Thelema, sex magic is alluded to in a roundabout way in the self-love bath spell, which, if that's your thing, maybe just consider the history of the practice. Conversely, the distinction she makes between witchcraft and Wicca is helpful, though, as with many New Age beliefs, it has to be somewhat vague to encompass the breadth of the belief of the different practitioners. Still, it is good to point out that Wicca is a belief system, whereas witchcraft is a practice. It is also interesting that she points out what spells can't do, as she says they may assist in creating the right environment for you mentally and possibly opening doors to fun experiences, but a spell will not go running for you or make you lose weight overnight. I suppose this section helps manage expectations to those who will be using these spells. Another issue I have, and this is not just this book, but is very common in the whole genre of witchcraft and magic, is that it presents certain beliefs as facts you have to accept. You have to buy into them without much of an explanation, whilst also saying it is not a belief system. And yes, it is not complex enough for a belief system when you say the full moon is cleansing, but when you give this as a statement without history, context, or where this belief comes from, then it becomes a belief you're expecting people to buy into. It is also vague around what can and can't be substituted in a spell, with the way it is written making it unclear what is and isn't a critical component. The book gives the reader a list of correspondences at the back, in which colours, moon phases, days of the week, crystals, elements and cardinal directions, and herbs and plants are all covered in order to help a practitioner substitute something they might not have or build their own spell. And she says spells can be performed by anyone who wishes to do so, regardless of age, sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, or religion. Making magic accessible to everyone is essential. So if you find a spell in this book that requires tools or ingredients you can't find, or steps or actions that you are not able to perform, adapt that spell to suit you and do not let it discourage or limit you. And she points towards the list of correspondences that you can use as substitutes. And at the end, she talks about how you can also use any spell in this book and adapt it to make it more specific to your intentions. However, she just said before that while being resourceful is important, you cannot substitute all ingredients within a spell and hope for the same result. To return to the baking analogy, you can't make a carrot cake without carrots. So what in each spell is the carrot? How much can you substitute? What if you can't get anything from the original spell, but you can get a substitution for each? Would it still add up to the same spell? It's very vague here. I think there are good intentions behind wanting to be vague like this. It's more inclusive if you can tell people they can swap things out if they don't have access to it or if they can't do something. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, though it opens the belief up to criticisms of being vague, indistinct, and directionless. Without limits, is anything a go? How far can you break a spell down before it becomes meaningless? Like I said, where is the carrot in this metaphorical cake? What are the key parts in making this work? Furthermore, when you're talking about things you might be eating or putting on your body, surely some substitutes might not work together and could be potentially harmful. Conversely, some things are presented as hard facts that you have to just accept, almost like a belief system, as I alluded to before. For example, the concept of the microcosm and macrocosm in how a spell works. She talks about spells being a drop in a still body of water. The drop creates ripples, spreading and creating an effect, showing everything is connected, as an example for how magic works. But, without going into where this theory comes from, this doesn't really explain anything. Another hard fact is that playing music is not enough to cleanse a space, whereas using a bell, singing or banging pots is, but no explanation as to why. Similarly, the light of the full moon is cleansing. Again, why? Now, I will say that I found the layout of this book quite clever, and I can imagine it being very useful to the practitioner. It's laid out like a good cookbook. You know when you get a cookbook with meat dishes, fish dishes, vegetarian meals, snacks and desserts, that sort of breakdown, where it's easy to flick to a section and then look at what sort of meat dish you might want, or what sort of vegetarian meal you might want. Well, this is similar in that it breaks spells down into categories, these being protection, prosperity, personal growth, health and well-being, love and sex, friendship and family, joy and serenity, work and ambition. And you can go into these sections and find what you're looking for within them. These topics are even broken down further within those sections, such as in protection, where you can find on-the-go protection or protection for your home. This feels like a useful layout, but I'd be interested to hear from anyone using this book as to how they found it. Each spell also shows the best time to do the spell and occasionally has tips or extra notes added in, which is an interesting touch. This book has a disclaimer section at the back, warning about consulting healthcare professionals before undertaking any of the spells set out in this book, and a few safety notes dotted throughout the book. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding, seek advice before drinking herbal teas, which is good advice. However, there may be a few points that have been missed. One example is in the section on black salt. She talks about sprinkling it on doorways and windowsills, and sprinkling it around your house and sweeping it away every new moon to renew it. However, salt is potentially poisonous to cats and dogs, so I would be very worried about leaving trails or piles of salt around the house. For something that is designed as a protection spell, please be careful if you're going to use this and make sure to protect your pets. Likewise, incense is mentioned numerous times in this book and in most magical related content, but please bear in mind that incense and even candles can be bad for pets and it can damage their lungs, so please do your research on this before using them. The artwork is interesting and gives the book a very unique look. It feels Eastern European or Russian in places. Some of the drawings are simple illustrations around the text, decorative flourishes, and some are full page drawings used to illustrate a spell or section of the book. Lots of animals are present, often in poses that semi-anthropomorphise them, giving the artwork a fairy tale or fable-like quality. Even though it's not a style of artwork I'm familiar with or tend to like normally, they were well executed and interesting, often linking to the spell being discussed in a way that ties the book together nicely. Overall, I found this book an interesting read, but somewhat shallow or vague. I haven't read a spell book before, but I do understand that the focus is mostly going to be on presenting spells for practitioners to try. However, as I have said, as it feels like it's aimed at new practitioners or those considering turning to witchcraft, I feel it should have explained some things in more detail. I'd be interested to hear what other people have thought of this book, and if you're a witch or use these spells, did you find it helpful? What did you like or dislike about it? I'd be interested in hearing your opinions, and please remember, this is just my opinions. If yours is different, that's fine, and I'd be interested in hearing your opinions. Discussions are good, arguments aren't. Please remember that. Anyway, that's all from me this week. Bye for now.